She wrote 11 words, sealed them in wax, and handed the letter to a boy on a horse. By sunrise, she was gone. No blood, no broken door, no sign that anyone had dragged her into the night. Just an empty bed, a cold hearth, and a letter that would take 10 years to reach the man it was written for. When it finally did, it did not bring comfort. It brought a question that would tear apart a village built on trust. What if the person everyone mourned was never dead at all? And what if the truth she carried could still cost someone their life? Her name was Elena Whitmore, and this is the story of the letter that outlived her disappearance, the man who spent a decade trying to decode it, and the secret that was worth more than her own freedom. To understand why a single letter could unravel an entire kingdom's peace, you first have to understand who Elena Whitmore was, who loved her, and who feared what she knew. There was Thomas Hale, the blacksmith's son she was promised to marry. There was Marcus Cade, the village elder whose word was treated as law. And there was a piece of land, a boundary dispute, and a debt that powerful men did not want spoken aloud. 3 questions will follow us through every part of this story. Why did Elena vanish the same night she finished that letter? Who did she believe would come looking for her? And did they? And when the truth finally surfaced years later, was it too late to matter, or had it been waiting all along for the right person to read it? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Elena Whitmore grew up on the eastern edge of a farming settlement called Millbrook Hollow, a cluster of stone cottages surrounded by wheat fields and guarded by a single wooden watchtower. Her father had died defending a grain shipment years earlier, and her mother raised her and her younger sister Grace, largely alone. Elena was known for 2 things in Millbrook Hollow: her handwriting, which the village priest said was finer than his own, and her memory, which seemed to hold every conversation she had ever overheard. Neighbors joked that if you wanted to know what happened at last season's harvest meeting, you did not ask the elder, you asked Elena. Thomas Hale had loved her since they were children. He was the son of the village blacksmith, a broad-shouldered young man who had spent his life around fire and iron, but had never raised his voice at another living soul. Their courtship was slow and old-fashioned, built on shared chores, quiet walks along the river, and letters passed between their families long before they were ever officially betrothed. Thomas had saved for 2 years to forge Elena a ring himself, hammering it late at night after his father had gone to sleep, determined that no merchant's ring would ever be good enough for her. Marcus Cade was a different kind of figure entirely. He was Millbrook Hollow's elder, appointed not by the crown but by tradition, the son of an elder whose father had been an elder before him. He settled land disputes, collected taxes owed to the regional lord, and was, by most accounts, fair. But fairness and power do not always survive contact with debt. In the 2 years before Elena disappeared, whispers had begun to circulate that Marcus owed a substantial sum to a neighboring lord over a failed trade agreement involving grain stores that never arrived. Nobody in the village dared ask him directly. Nobody except, it seemed, Elena. Elena had taken on work as a scribe for the elders' council, transcribing land agreements, trade records, and correspondence between Millbrook Hollow and the regional court. It was steady work, respected work, and it placed her closer to the village's private affairs than almost anyone else. Her mother worried about it. Her mother told her more than once that a woman who knows too much about powerful men's business rarely benefits from that knowledge. Elena laughed it off. She told her mother that words on a page could not hurt her, that ink was not a blade. She would come to regret that belief. In the months before her disappearance, those who knew Elena best noticed small changes. She grew quieter during council meetings. She began locking a wooden chest in her room that had never been locked before. She asked Thomas, almost in passing, whether he trusted Marcus Cade, and when Thomas asked why, she changed the subject and never raised it again. Grace, her younger sister, would later recall finding Elena awake near the hearth at odd hours, writing by candlelight, then folding the pages and hiding them beneath the floorboard under her bed. When Grace asked what she was writing, Elena told her it was nothing, just practice for her scribe work. It was not practice, it was a record. The final weeks before Elena's disappearance were marked by a series of small, easily dismissed events that only made sense in hindsight. A trade ledger Elena had transcribed for Marcus Cade went missing from the council hall, and Marcus quietly asked her to recreate it from memory, rather than report the loss to the regional lord's tax collector. Elena did as asked, but she kept a second copy for herself, tucked beneath that same loose floorboard. Around the same time, a merchant from the neighboring settlement of Ashford Vale arrived in Millbrook Hollow, asking pointed questions about grain shipments that had allegedly been delivered the previous autumn but had never actually arrived at their destination. Marcus met privately with the merchant for nearly 2 hours. Elena was called in briefly to transcribe part of that meeting, then dismissed before it concluded. That night, according to Grace, Elena did not eat dinner with the family. She stayed in her room with the door closed, and when Grace pressed her ear to the wood, she heard nothing but the scratch of a quill against parchment, on and off, for hours. 3 days later, Thomas proposed a date for their wedding, hoping to lift Elena's spirits, which had grown visibly heavier in recent weeks. She agreed to the date, a spring wedding, and for one evening she seemed almost like herself again, laughing at his stories by the river, teasing him about the crooked line of iron in the ring he had made her. Those who witnessed them together that night said there was no indication, none at all, that anything was wrong. Thomas would later say it was the last truly happy night he ever spent with her, and he replayed every second of it in his memory for years afterward, searching for a clue he might have missed. The following evening, Elena asked Grace to fetch a young stable hand named Peter, a boy of perhaps 14, who occasionally carried messages to Ashford Vale in exchange for coin. When Peter arrived, Elena handed him a sealed letter and a small pouch of silver, more silver than the errand should have required. She told him the letter was for Thomas, but that he was not to deliver it immediately. She instructed him to wait, to keep it hidden, and to only hand it to Thomas if a full season passed without word from her. Peter, confused but paid well, agreed. That night, Elena went to bed as she always did. Grace remembers hearing her humming softly through the shared wall between their rooms, an old harvest tune their mother used to sing. By the time the sun rose over Millbrook Hollow's wheat fields, Elena Whitmore was gone. Her bed had been slept in. Her window was latched from the inside. There was no sign of struggle, no torn clothing, no blood on the floorboards. Her boots were missing, her cloak was missing, and the loose floorboard beneath her bed, the one that had hidden her private pages for months, had been pried open and left empty. Whoever took those pages, if anyone did, left everything else behind. And Elena Whitmore simply was not there anymore. Thomas Hale was the first to raise the alarm, arriving at Elena's cottage at dawn, as he did most mornings, only to find her mother in the doorway, pale and shaking, insisting that Elena had vanished sometime in the night. Within hours, half of Millbrook Hollow had gathered at the property, searching the wheat fields, the riverbank, and the surrounding woodline for any trace of her. Marcus Cade, as village elder, organized the formal search parties, dividing the men into groups and dispatching riders to Ashford Vale and 2 other neighboring settlements to ask whether anyone matching Elena's description had passed through. For the first week, theories multiplied by the hour. Some believed she had been taken by bandits who occasionally raided the trade roads between settlements, though no other property had been stolen and no ransom note ever arrived. Others whispered that she had simply run away, perhaps overwhelmed by the pressure of her upcoming wedding, though everyone who knew Thomas and Elena together dismissed that idea outright. A smaller, quieter group began to wonder aloud whether Elena's work for the council and her sudden access to sensitive trade records had something to do with her disappearance. That theory was not popular. It was not popular because voicing it meant questioning Marcus Cade, and in Millbrook Hollow, questioning the elder was not something done lightly. Thomas refused to accept any explanation that did not involve searching every inch of the region. He organized his own search efforts separate from the official ones, riding for days at a time to nearby settlements, showing a hand-drawn portrait of Elena to merchants, innkeepers, and travelers along the trade roads. He found nothing conclusive, though he did hear one unsettling account from an innkeeper in Ashford Vale, who claimed a young woman matching Elena's description had passed through roughly a week after her disappearance, traveling alone, refusing to give her name, and paying for a room with coin rather than trade goods, which was unusual for a woman traveling without an escort in that region. When Thomas brought this information back to Marcus Cade, expecting the elder to intensify the search toward Ashford Vale and beyond, Marcus instead cautioned him against chasing rumors from unreliable innkeepers. He suggested that the sighting was likely a case of mistaken identity, and that continuing to spread such stories could damage Elena's reputation should she return on her own. Thomas found this response strange, given that Marcus had seemed so eager to help in the search's early days, but he was too consumed by grief and hope to question it deeply at the time. Weeks turned into months. The official search wound down, as searches for missing persons often did in villages with limited resources and no additional evidence to pursue. Marcus Cade publicly expressed sorrow over the loss of, in his words, one of Millbrook Hollow's finest young minds, and even proposed erecting a small memorial stone near the council hall in her honor, a gesture that many villagers found touching, though Grace, Elena's sister, found herself strangely unsettled by it. She could not explain why at the time, only that something about the timing and the man proposing it felt wrong in a way she could not name. During this period, Grace began quietly asking her own questions. She revisited the loose floorboard in Elena's room, now permanently empty, and tried to recall everything Elena had ever said about her work transcribing for the council. She remembered the missing ledger. She remembered the merchant from Ashford Vale. She remembered Elena's strange question to Thomas about trust. Piece by piece, without telling anyone, Grace began assembling her own private theory, one that pointed not toward bandits or a broken heart, but toward the very man leading the search for her sister. She kept this theory to herself for nearly a year, terrified of what it might mean to accuse Millbrook Hollow's elder of involvement in her sister's disappearance without a shred of solid proof. It would take the arrival of a very unexpected visitor to finally bring that theory into the light. Nearly 2 years after Elena's disappearance, a traveling merchant named Walter Finch arrived in Millbrook Hollow, carrying goods from a distant coastal settlement called Brannigan's Port. During a routine conversation at the village market, Grace mentioned her sister's name in passing, while asking, as she often did with any traveler, whether he had encountered anyone matching Elena's description. To her shock, Walter Finch said he had indeed known a young woman by a different name, a scribe living quietly in Brannigan's Port, who had once let slip in a moment of trust that her true name was Elena, and that she had come from a farming settlement far to the east. Grace did not sleep that night. Within a week, using savings she had quietly set aside for 2 years, she convinced Thomas to travel with her to Brannigan's Port, a journey of nearly 10 days by cart and foot. Thomas, who had never fully abandoned hope despite the passage of time, agreed without hesitation. What they found in Brannigan's Port confirmed Grace's darkest suspicion and, at the same time, offered a reason for hope that neither of them had allowed themselves to feel in years. Elena was alive. She was working as a scribe for a coastal merchants' guild, living under a different name, having built a quiet, careful life far from Millbrook Hollow. When she saw Thomas and Grace standing in the doorway of her small rented room, she did not run, and she did not deny who she was. She wept, embraced them both, and finally, after 2 years of silence, told them the truth she had been too afraid to speak aloud in her own village. Elena had discovered, through her work transcribing trade records, that Marcus Cade had been diverting grain shipments meant for the regional lord's tax collection, selling them privately to cover a personal debt, and falsifying the ledgers to hide the theft. The missing grain that the Ashford Vale merchant had asked about was never lost to bandits or bad weather, as Marcus had claimed publicly. It had been sold. When Elena began quietly documenting the discrepancies, intending to eventually bring them to the regional lord's attention, Marcus discovered what she was doing. He never threatened her directly, Elena explained, because a direct threat would have been too obvious, too traceable. Instead, he made a quiet, chilling suggestion during a private meeting, that scribes who uncovered inconvenient truths about powerful men rarely lived long, peaceful lives in small villages, and that perhaps it would be wisest for her to forget what she had seen entirely. Elena understood the suggestion for what it was. She could not go to the regional lord directly, not without evidence that could survive Marcus destroying the original records, and not without risking her own safety and her family's in the process. So she made a decision that would define the next several years of her life. She copied every incriminating record she could find, hid the letter for Thomas as an insurance policy in case something happened to her, and disappeared entirely, choosing exile and anonymity over confrontation, believing it was the only way to keep both herself and her family safe from a man who controlled the entire village's justice system. The letter Elena had left with young Peter all those years earlier had never actually reached Thomas. Peter, frightened after Elena's disappearance and the intense searching that followed, panicked and buried the sealed letter beneath a stone near the riverbank rather than risk being seen carrying suspicious correspondence during an active investigation. He told no one, assuming the matter would resolve itself, and as the years passed, guilt kept him silent rather than compelling him to speak up. It was only after Thomas and Grace returned from Brannigan's Port with Elena's confession that Peter, now a young man, finally came forward, confessing what he had done and leading them to the buried letter. When Thomas finally opened it, years after it was written, he found 11 words in Elena's unmistakable handwriting. "If I am gone, do not trust the man in charge." Beneath those words was a second page, one Peter had never known existed, folded separately and sealed with a different wax. That page contained a detailed, dated account of the falsified grain ledgers, the debt Marcus Cade owed to a neighboring lord, and the private meeting in which he had suggested Elena forget what she had discovered. It was, in essence, a confession written not by the guilty party, but by the woman he had threatened into silence, preserved as protection in case her worst fears came true. Armed with this letter, the copies Elena had preserved in Brannigan's Port, and testimony from the original Ashford Vale merchant who had first raised questions about the missing grain, Thomas and Grace brought the evidence directly to the regional lord's court. Marcus Cade was summoned to answer for the discrepancies. Initially, he denied everything, insisting the records had been misinterpreted and that Elena had fabricated the accusations out of some personal grievance. But when confronted with his own handwriting on the original ledgers, cross-referenced against Elena's meticulous copies, and faced with the merchant's testimony about the grain that never arrived, his denials collapsed. Marcus Cade was stripped of his position as elder, ordered to repay the diverted grain's value to the regional lord, and banished from Millbrook Hollow entirely, forbidden from ever holding a position of authority again in the region. It was not the harshest punishment imaginable for a man who had effectively exiled a young woman from her home and family for 2 years through fear alone, but in a system built on land, debt, and reputation rather than dungeons and executions. It was a significant and public downfall for a man who had once controlled the fate of an entire village. Elena returned to Millbrook Hollow shortly afterward, uncertain of what kind of welcome awaited her after 2 years of unexplained absence. What she found was a community that, upon learning the truth, largely embraced her return with relief and admiration rather than suspicion. Thomas, who had never once considered marrying anyone else during those 2 years, asked her again to be his wife, presenting her with the same hand-forged ring he had made years earlier, which he had carried with him every single day of her absence. They were married within the year, in a small ceremony attended by nearly the entire village, including Grace, and including Peter, who Elena forgave without hesitation once she learned the full story of his fear and silence. Elena Whitmore's story raises a question that extends far beyond one village and one dishonest elder. What do you do when the person meant to protect you is the very person you have every reason to fear? Elena chose silence and exile over direct confrontation, believing it was the only way to survive a system stacked against her. Some might call that cowardice. Others might call it the only rational choice available to a young woman with no power and no allies in a position of authority. We would genuinely love to know what you think. Would you have done what Elena did, disappearing and waiting for the truth to surface on its own terms? Or would you have confronted the danger head-on, whatever the cost? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one, and we are always fascinated by how differently people see these choices depending on their own experiences. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, wait until you hear what happened in the settlement of Ashford Vale itself, just one valley over, where a similar case of missing grain records led to a discovery far darker than anyone in this story ever imagined. That story is coming soon, and you will not want to miss it. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing so you never miss one of our upcoming stories. And give this video a like if you made it all the way to the end with us. We put an enormous amount of research and care into bringing these stories to life, and your support genuinely helps us keep doing it. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next story.